Okay, I'm here with my dad, Art.
How you doing? This is Art. Megan Morentz's dad for her full life and not a day longer. Thank you.
Sorry, can we do that? I started laughing. Oh, no, wait, stop for too long.
Megan's going to interview me.
Hi, I'm with my dad, Art.
Hi, Art Morentes. I'm Megan's dad. This is take 2. Went well, but not so well.
Okay, this is my dad in the 80s with my sister. Okay, ready? All right, as a minority, do you feel as though you were treated differently?
In the 80s?
Yes.
It all depends. I was raised up in LA, and being, I think, a handful of Latins in an area where it was mostly African Americans. I was definitely treated differently. It was not an easy experience to live at that time. But we made the best of it, and we did have a handful of friends that we unfortunately are not in contact anymore.
Sorry to hear. What was it like? What was life like in the 80s?
Life was fun. I had a good time. I was fortunate to be 18 in 83, so I lived the whole 80s in my late teens and early 20s, so I had a good time. A lot of nice music. MTV just came out. We had at the time, we were introduced to cable, which was at the time it was called On. And it was a box that literally had an on button. You turn it on and you watch cable, which was one channel. Addition to the other 4 channels that we had, which is, at the time, I thought that was a lot of channels.
Yeah.
Nowadays, we have 1,000 channels and nothing to watch. So I guess it's just a trade-off.
Yep. Do you notice any change in morals compared to the generation of your parents?
From the 80s to my parents, I didn't live my parents' generation. They lived in Mexico, so I couldn't tell you exactly what happened in their generation.
Okay.
But I know that a lot of stuff that I did in the 80s, they were pretty much not acceptable for it. They didn't, well, it was different. The culture was different. They were both from Mexico, and they both didn't speak a lot of English. So and we weren't crazy. I mean, we basically just did what we needed to do. Went to school and did what we needed to do. We actually commuted all the way from South Central all the way to East LA. And they were okay, but for the most part, their culture was definitely different than my culture.
Yeah.
Even if their culture would have been in the United States or living in the 50s, it would have been totally different than the 80s. It's funny, though, because in the 80s, I used to dream of maybe being born in the 50s and have a good time as living in the 50s. But the 80s turned out to be pretty good.
Yeah.
You had, like I said, the MTV generation. You had K-Rock, which was introducing new rock or new alternative rock, which was kind of cool. We started out with Richard Blade, and that's what I used to listen to when I used to go to college. And he's still on TV. As a matter of fact, we've gone to nightclubs where he actually cameos. So they play 80s, and he goes in there and DJs for like 15 minutes. So my wife and I still follow Richard Blake just to live the 80s.
Yeah. Were there any political events that comes to mind when you think of the 80s?
Political events, yeah. There's a lot of stuff that I lived. Basically, the Iran-Contra was in the 80s. The hostages, the Iranian hostages, a lot of stuff from the Middle East. And it's funny, as a young age, in the 17, 18s, I knew the Middle East was always going to be a hot place, and it still is to this day.
Temperature-wise?
Also temperature.
Yeah. Hold on. Were there any sayings or slangs you used?
There's always slangs for the 80s. I grew up in South Central or LA area, around the Coliseum USC, and there was a couple of things there. When I met Jennifer's mom, I had 3 or 4 things I used to say. It's a trip, though, or it was one of them that I couldn't get out of it. And eventually I grew out of it about a week or two ago.
About a week or two ago. What do you think of American values in the 80s?
The American values in the 80s. The 80s is totally different than the 2018s. In the 80s, you didn't have the now generation. I mean, things took a while to get around. So our little bubble was a lot smaller in the 80s than it was now. I lived through the 84 Olympics, so that introduced me a little bit to different cultures for a short time. We were right there. So we used to walk out there and we used to buy pins and trade pins, and we actually had, my mother's place had a long driveway. We used to rent her parking to people. So we at the beginning started out putting, parking for $20. Next thing you know, we have the same people just coming, parking their cars and dropping off the keys, giving us a 20 and walking away and coming back 4, 5, 6 hours later. And this happened for the whole Olympics. So it was always the same people. So that was one thing that happened in the 80s. And when you're 17, 18, 20 bucks times, I don't know, 8, 9, 10 times, it added up. So I don't know what we did to the money, but it came in handy.
Yeah. Were there any positive or negative society changes you noticed in the 1980s compared to today?
Basically, it's the same, just different year.
Okay.
Different people playing different roles. Back then, you basically you got your little job and save up enough money, and then you were able to go ahead and buy your running car for $1,000.
Wow.
Nowadays, you get a little job, you work for like 10 years to get yourself a $10,000 or $20,000 car, which is probably the same car that I bought back in the 80s. A lot more plastic, a lot less metal.
What would you do for fun in the 80s?
What did I do for fun? We didn't live far from the Coliseum, so we used to go out there and just hang out. We used to, build bikes, and then a bunch of friends would just drive around. They were lowrider bikes, believe it or not. We started with, they were Stingrays. So we had Stingrays, so we went ahead and just fixed them up, and that introduced us to restoring cars. I mean, that's what I did back there for fun. Didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't do the movies as often as we wanted to, or didn't. Disneyland was like once every 2-3 years, and at the same time, it wasn't $300 to get into Disneyland. It was like $38, and you got a booklet. And then the booklet had A, E, C, and E rides. So each booklet, depending on how much you paid, you got one of each or 2 E rides. And the E rides were actually the best rides of all. So most ticket books only had one of those. And so, but you had to experience that. It was interesting. A lot less lines.
What was unemployment like in the 1980s?
1980s, from what I gather, when I was a senior at our high school, our English teacher told us that it was basically 7.5, 7.4. So that was her scare tactics to go ahead and go to school and get a good education. Most jobs were full-time, 8 hours, unless you were going to school, and then you basically had to get a work permit that only lets you work 4 hours. But other than that, they were all full-times with insurance, which nowadays is quite the opposite. I'm assuming right now there's a lot of half-time jobs with no insurance. That's why the employment, but it's probably like a lot lower, half of that, but a lot of people working half shifts.
Okay.
From what I gather.
Well, thank you so much for letting me interview you.
Sure. Yeah. My pleasure.
Okay. That's all I got for today.
Thank you. Have a good one.